The bullet shattered the window of the schoolhouse, just as Grace Sullivan was conjugating Latin verbs on the blackboard, and she knew immediately that someone had finally made good on their threats. She dropped the chalk and pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering as the children screamed and dove beneath their desks. Through the broken glass, she could hear men laughing, their voices thick with whiskey and malice, and she recognized them as the same ranch hands who had been making her life miserable since she arrived in Stockton, California, 6 months ago with her teaching certificate and her trunk full of books. "That is enough for today," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Go home to your families, quickly now through the back door." The children scrambled out, their eyes wide with fear, and Grace stood alone in the empty schoolhouse, staring at the hole in the window. This was the 3rd time this month. The school board had already warned her that they were receiving complaints, not about her teaching, which even her critics admitted was exceptional, but about her very presence. A woman with a university education was unnatural, they said. Dangerous. She filled the children's heads with ideas that would make them dissatisfied with honest work. The fact that she could read Greek, discuss philosophy, and solve mathematical equations that stumped the local banker seemed to offend the very nature of things. She gathered her books slowly, methodically, refusing to let them see her run. But when she stepped outside into the dusty street, she found a small crowd waiting. Not a friendly one. "There she is," someone muttered, "Miss High and Mighty with her fancy education." Martha Kincaid, the blacksmith's wife, stepped forward, her face twisted with something that looked almost like fear. "My Henry came home yesterday talking about ancient Rome and democracy. He should be learning his numbers and his Bible, not filling his head with ideas about how common people can govern themselves." "I teach both arithmetic and scripture, Mrs. Kincaid," Grace said quietly. "The study of history helps children understand the world they live in." "The world they live in is Stockton, California, not some heathen empire," Martha shot back. "A woman has no business knowing the things you know. It is not natural. It is not decent." Others murmured their agreement. Grace recognized most of them as parents, people she had tried to serve faithfully, people whose children were thriving under her instruction. But fear made people cruel, and her education seemed to frighten them more than any outlaw ever could. She was walking back to her boarding house, eyes burning with unshed tears, when she nearly collided with a man leading his horse down the street. He caught her elbow to steady her, and she looked up into a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a summer sky. "Careful there, miss," he said, tipping his hat. Then he saw her expression, the way her hands shook as she clutched her books. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said automatically, trying to step around him, but he did not move. He was looking past her at the crowd dispersing near the schoolhouse at the broken window, and his jaw tightened. "Let me guess, you are the teacher everyone has been talking about." "I suppose I am." She lifted her chin, expecting more judgment, more condemnation. Instead, he smiled. It transformed his whole face, warming those blue eyes until they crinkled at the corners. "Then I am pleased to finally meet you. I am Vincent Sawyer. I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here, and I have been meaning to ride in and introduce myself." "Why would you want to do that?" The question came out more sharply than she intended, but she was tired of games, tired of people who pretended kindness only to reveal their true feelings later. "Because I heard you are teaching the children astronomy and literature and proper mathematics, not just basic sums," he said. "And I wanted to thank you. My nephew Tom has been staying with me while his parents are back east, and he comes home every day excited about what he learned. First time I have ever seen that boy enthusiastic about anything besides horses." Grace stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You approve of my teaching?" "Approve?" Vincent laughed. "Miss, I think you might be the best thing that ever happened to this town, even if half of them are too foolish to see it. Smart women are the best kind of women to know. Anyone who thinks otherwise is an idiot." Something loosened in her chest, some tight knot of fear and loneliness she had been carrying for months. "That is a minority opinion around here, Mr. Sawyer. Maybe so, but I stand by it." He glanced at the books in her arms. "Can I walk you wherever you are heading? Those folks looked pretty worked up, and I would feel better knowing you got there safely." She should have said no. She should have maintained proper distance. But she was so tired of being alone, of facing the hostility by herself. "I am staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Oak Street." "Then Oak Street it is." He fell into step beside her, leading his horse with easy confidence. "What were you teaching when they decided to shoot out your window?" "Latin," she admitted. "I was showing the older students how many English words derive from Latin roots. I thought it might help with their vocabulary and spelling." "Sounds useful to me. I studied some Latin myself, years ago, before I went west. Never got very far with it, but I remember enough to recognize a good teacher when I hear about one." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, and Grace found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. He was tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from hard work rather than casual violence. His clothes were clean but worn, practical rather than showy. Everything about him suggested a man who was comfortable in his own skin, who did not need to prove anything to anyone. "Why did you come west?" she asked. "If you had education back east, you could have done anything." "Same reason as most people, I suppose. Wanted to build something of my own, make my own way. Got tired of people telling me who I should be based on my family name." He glanced at her. "What about you? What brought a university-educated woman to Stockton?" "The same thing, actually. I wanted to use my education, to do something meaningful with it. Back in Boston, people thought it was amusing that I studied classics and mathematics, like it was some harmless eccentricity. But no one would actually hire me to do anything with that knowledge. Out here, I thought perhaps things would be different." "And instead you found they were worse," he said quietly. "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "I thought the West was supposed to be about opportunity, about leaving old prejudices behind. But it seems people brought their fears with them." They had reached the boarding house, and Vincent stopped at the gate. "Miss Sullivan, may I tell you something?" "Those people who are afraid of your intelligence, who want to shame you for being educated. They are afraid because deep down, they know you are right. They know the world is changing and education is power, and they are terrified of losing the little bit of control they think they have. That does not make what they are doing right, but maybe it helps to understand it. Understanding them does not make it hurt less when they shoot at my schoolhouse," Grace said, but there was no bitterness in her voice now, just exhaustion. "No, I suppose it does not." He hesitated, as if weighing his next words. "Look, I know we just met, and I have got no right to ask this, but would you consider coming out to the ranch sometime? Tom would be thrilled, and honestly, I would enjoy having someone to talk to who can discuss something besides cattle prices and weather. I have got books gathering dust that I would love to share with someone who actually appreciates them." Grace knew she should refuse. It would be improper, and it would give the gossips even more ammunition. But looking up at his honest face, at the genuine interest and respect in his eyes, she found herself nodding. "I would like that, Mr. Sawyer." "Vincent," he corrected with a smile. "And I will come by on Saturday, if that suits you. We can make it a proper visit, with Mrs. Henderson as chaperone if that makes you more comfortable." Saturday would be fine. She watched him ride away. And for the first time since coming to Stockton, she felt something that might have been hope. The rest of the week passed in a blur of tension. The school board called a special meeting to discuss her future, and Grace spent an evening defending her curriculum to men who kept interrupting her to explain things she understood far better than they did. They decided to let her continue, but only because they could not find a replacement before the end of term. It was a hollow victory, and Grace knew her time in Stockton was likely limited. But Saturday came, bright and clear, and with it came Vincent Sawyer, looking scrubbed and nervous in his good shirt. Mrs. Henderson, who had been suspiciously enthusiastic about chaperoning, insisted on packing a lunch, and they set out in Vincent's wagon with enough food to feed a small army. The ride to the ranch took them through rolling hills covered in golden grass, past oak trees that provided patches of welcome shade. Vincent pointed out landmarks and told her about the area, his love for this land evident in every word. He had built the ranch from nothing, he explained, starting with a few head of cattle and a one-room cabin, slowly expanding until he had something worth being proud of. "It is not fancy," he warned as they crested a hill and the ranch came into view, "but it is mine." Grace looked at the neat barn, the sturdy house with its wide porch, the corrals where horses moved lazily in the morning sun, and thought it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. Tom, Vincent's nephew, came running out to meet them, a gangly boy of 12 with his uncle's blue eyes and an enthusiasm that made Grace smile. "Miss Sullivan, Uncle Vince said you might come. I have been working on those mathematics problems you gave us, and I got them all right this time." "Did you now? That is excellent, Tom. Perhaps you can show me later." Mrs. Henderson settled herself on the porch with some knitting, playing the part of the chaperone but giving them enough space to talk freely. Vincent showed Grace around the ranch, introducing her to his horses, his cattle, his dreams for the future. He talked about wanting to improve the breeding stock, about building a bigger house someday, about maybe starting a library in town if he could convince enough people to contribute books. "A library," Grace said, enchanted by the idea. "Do you really think Stockton would support one?" "I think if we built it, they would use it even if they complained about it," Vincent said. "People are funny that way. They resist change until it is right in front of them, and then they cannot imagine life without it." They ended up in his study, a small room lined with bookshelves that made Grace gasp with delight. He had everything from agricultural manuals to Shakespeare, from history texts to novels, all carefully organized and clearly well loved. "This is remarkable," she said, running her fingers along the spines. "How did you collect all of these?" slowly. "Whenever I go to San Francisco or Sacramento, I stop at bookshops. Sometimes I order them through the mail. Reading is one of my few luxuries." He pulled down a worn copy of Homer. "This was my father's. He used to read it to me when I was young. I barely understood a word of it, but I loved the sound of it, the rhythm of the language." "The Odyssey," Grace said, taking the book reverently. "One of my favorites. Have you read it in translation?" "Several times, but I always wished I could read it in the original Greek. I studied some in school, but not enough to really understand it." An idea sparked in Grace's mind, wild and improbable. "I could teach you," she said. "I mean, if you wanted. I could give you lessons in Greek and we could read it together." Vincent's face lit up like a boy's on Christmas morning. "Would you? Really? I would pay you, of course." "I do not want your money," Grace said quickly. "I just want someone to share it with. Do you know how long it has been since I had someone to discuss literature with? Since I could speak Greek or Latin without people looking at me like I was possessed." "Then we have an agreement," Vincent said, holding out his hand. Greek lessons in exchange for a place where you can be yourself without judgment. Grace took his hand, feeling the rough calluses, the strength in his grip. Agreement, she said, and knew that something important had just begun. The lesson started the following week. Grace would ride out to the ranch twice a week after school, and they would spend the evening working through Greek texts, while Tom did his homework at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Henderson gradually became less necessary as a chaperone. Vincent was a quick study, picking up the grammar faster than most of her students, and their discussions ranged far beyond simple translation. They debated philosophy, history, the nature of heroism and home. They argued over interpretations, laughed over Vincent's creative attempts at pronunciation, and somewhere in the midst of all that learning, they fell in love. It happened so gradually that Grace could not point to a single moment and say, "That was when." Maybe it was the evening Vincent brought her wildflowers and sheepishly admitted he did not know their proper botanical names, but thought she would like them anyway. Maybe it was the day she found him defending her teaching methods to a group of ranchers in town, his voice firm and unyielding. Maybe it was the quiet afternoon when she looked up from her book to find him watching her with such tenderness in his eyes that her breath caught in her throat. Or maybe it was all of those moments together, building into something neither of them had expected but both desperately wanted. "I need to tell you something," Vincent said one evening in late September. They were sitting on his porch, watching the sun set over the hills, their Greek texts forgotten for the moment. "I know people in town are still giving you trouble. I know the school board is looking for excuses to dismiss you, and I know that being seen with me probably does not help your reputation any. Vincent, I do not care what they think, but I do." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "I care because you deserve better than a town that cannot see how extraordinary you are. You deserve students who appreciate you, a community that values education, a place where you can be brilliant without apologizing for it." Grace's heart sank. Was he about to tell her to leave? To stop coming to the ranch? "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I love you," Vincent said simply. "I am saying that I have loved you probably since that first day when you stood there clutching your books and refusing to let them see you break. I am saying that smart women are not just the best kind to know, they are the only kind I want. And I am asking if you might possibly feel the same way about a cowboy who can barely conjugate Greek verbs without your help." Relief and joy flooded through her in equal measure. "You can conjugate them perfectly well and you know it," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "And yes, I love you too. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "Then marry me," Vincent said. "Marry me and let us build something together. You can teach if you want, or we can start that library we talked about, or you can do whatever makes you happy. I've got enough land and resources to support us both. All I want is you, Grace. Your brilliance, your passion, your stubborn refusal to be anything less than who you are." "The town will talk," she warned, even as her heart soared. "Let them talk. I have spent too much of my life worrying about what other people think. I would rather spend the rest of it with you." Grace kissed him then, there on the porch with the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and it felt like coming home. They married in October, a small ceremony at the ranch with Tom as best man and Mrs. Henderson weeping happily throughout. The school board, predictably, dismissed Grace from her teaching position the moment they heard about the engagement, claiming it was inappropriate for a married woman to teach. Grace might have fought them once, but she had other plans now. Vincent had been serious about the library. They used one of the ranch buildings, a sturdy structure that had been a storage shed, and transformed it into Stockton's first public library. Grace organized the books, created a lending system, and started offering evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading or learn new subjects. Vincent handled the business side, convincing local merchants to donate funds and materials, negotiating with Sacramento for additional books, turning their dream into reality. The resistance was fierce at first. The same people who had opposed Grace's teaching opposed the library even more. But Vincent was respected in the community in a way Grace had never been, and he used that influence ruthlessly. He pointed out that education meant better business practices, better ranching techniques, better opportunities for everyone. He invited skeptics to see the library for themselves, to watch their neighbors learning and growing. And slowly, grudgingly, opposition turned to acceptance. Grace still faced whispers and judgment from some quarters, but it mattered less now. She had Vincent beside her, believing in her, supporting her, loving her for exactly who she was. She had work that fulfilled her, using her education to help people who genuinely wanted to learn. And she had a home where she could be herself without fear or shame. Tom thrived under their care, growing from a boy into a young man who talked about maybe becoming a teacher himself someday. Vincent's ranch prospered, and with it, their ability to expand the library's offerings. Grace started a book club for women, and found that many of the wives and daughters who had shunned her were secretly hungry for intellectual stimulation. They came hesitantly at first, making excuses about just wanting to improve their reading, but soon they were debating literature and history with the same passion Grace had always felt. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with storms that kept them inside for days at a time. But Grace had never been happier. They would sit by the fire, reading aloud to each other, or talking late into the night about everything and nothing. Vincent continued his Greek lessons, determined to read Homer in the original, and Grace started learning about ranching and agriculture, fascinated by the practical application of principles she had only known in theory. "You were right," she told him one snowy evening, "about people being afraid of change. I spent so much time being angry at them, but I never really understood why they were so threatened." "And now?" Vincent asked, pulling her closer against his side. "Now I think they were afraid of feeling inadequate. If education was valuable, then their lack of it meant something. If I could do things they could not, it challenged their understanding of how the world should work. It was easier to tear me down than to build themselves up." "You are getting wise in your old age," Vincent teased. Grace was 24, he was 27, and they both knew they had decades ahead of them. "I learned from the best," she said, kissing his cheek. In the spring, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy and terror in equal measure. She worried about the birth, about being a good mother, about how a child would change their lives. But Vincent was steady and sure, his confidence helping calm her fears. "You are the smartest, strongest, most capable person I know," he told her. "If anyone can figure out this parenting thing, it is you, and I will be right there beside you the whole time." Their son was born in November, a year after their wedding, with Mrs. Henderson acting as midwife and Vincent pacing anxiously outside until he was allowed in to meet his child. They named him Henry, after Vincent's father, and Grace felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. Motherhood was harder than any academic challenge she had ever faced, but also more rewarding. She marveled at every tiny change, every new skill Henry developed. Vincent was a devoted father, utterly unafraid of diapers or midnight feedings, and watching him with their son made Grace fall even more deeply in love with him. The library continued to grow, even with Grace scaling back her hours to care for Henry. Vincent hired a young woman named Ellen to help with the day-to-day operations, and Grace focused on acquisitions and programming. They started a scholarship fund to send promising students to university, something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Tom graduated from school at 17 and announced he wanted to attend Teachers College in Sacramento. Vincent and Grace sent him off with pride and financial support, knowing that they had played a role in shaping his future. He came back for visits full of ideas and enthusiasm, telling them about new educational theories and promising to return to Stockton when he finished his degree. "You did that," Vincent told Grace as they watched Tom ride away after one visit. "You inspired him to want to learn, to want to teach others. That day you conjugated Latin verbs in a schoolhouse with a bullet hole in the window. You changed his life." "We did that," Grace corrected. "You showed him that learning was valuable, that intelligence was nothing to be ashamed of. You gave him a role model of what a good man looks like." Henry grew from infant to toddler, curious and bright and constantly getting into mischief. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, and Grace could already see the intelligence sparking in his questions. By age 3, he was learning his letters, sitting on Grace's lap in the library while she worked, absorbing language and knowledge like a sponge. Grace sometimes taught him Greek words, simple ones, and Vincent would laugh and shake his head. "Are you trying to make him even more of an outsider than we are?" "I am trying to give him every advantage," Grace said. "And besides, he enjoys it. Look at his face when he figures out a new word." "He has your face," Vincent said softly. "That exact expression of delight when something finally makes sense. God, I love both of you so much." Life was not perfect. There were still people in Stockton who disapproved of Grace, who thought she was unnatural or inappropriate. There were setbacks and challenges, difficult seasons on the ranch, illnesses that scared them, moments when Grace wondered if she had made the right choices. But through it all, she had Vincent, steady and sure, loving her not despite her intelligence but because of it. On their 5th anniversary, Vincent took her back to the spot where he had proposed, the porch overlooking the sunset. Henry was with Mrs. Henderson, giving them a rare evening alone. 5 years, Vincent said, handing her a wrapped package. 5 years since I convinced the smartest woman in California to take a chance on a cowboy." Grace opened the package to find a book, hand-bound in leather. She opened it carefully and gasped. It was the Odyssey in ancient Greek, a beautiful edition that must have cost a fortune. "Vincent, this is too much." "It is not nearly enough," he said. "Grace, before I met you, I thought I had a good life. I had land, work I was proud of, a future I had built with my own hands, but I did not have purpose beyond survival. I did not have someone who challenged me to be better, to think deeper, to see the world in new ways. You gave me that. You gave me everything that matters." "You gave me acceptance," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me a place where I could be myself. You told me that smart women are the best kind to know, and you meant it. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" "Then we are both lucky," Vincent said, pulling her into his arms. "Because I found you and you found me, and somehow we built this life together." They stood there as the sun set, holding each other, and Grace thought about the girl who had arrived in Stockton with her books and her dreams, facing hostility and shame for daring to be educated. She thought about the cowboy who had seen her worth when no one else would, who had loved her mind as much as her heart. And she thought about the future stretching ahead of them, full of possibilities and promise. The library became a fixture in Stockton, so integrated into community life that people forgot there had ever been a time without it. Tom returned after completing his degree and took over the teaching position at the school, bringing with him Grace's methods and Vincent's support. Ellen married a local rancher and started her own lending library in the next town over, spreading the idea further. Grace had 2 more children, a daughter named Julia when Henry was 4, and another son named Michael 3 years after that. Each birth was easier than the last, or perhaps she was just more confident. Vincent was there for all of them, devoted and present in a way that made other women look at their own husbands with new expectations. Raising 3 children while running a library should have been impossible, but Grace had help. Vincent was a true partner, sharing the work of parenting without being asked. Mrs. Henderson became a sort of honorary grandmother, always ready to watch the children when needed. And the community, slowly but surely, came around. Women who had once shunned Grace began bringing their daughters to the library, wanting them to have opportunities they never had. Men who had mocked education started asking about books on farming techniques or animal husbandry, sheepishly admitting they wanted to improve their practices. Grace started a women's suffrage group, knowing it was controversial but unable to stay silent on issues that mattered. Vincent stood beside her at meetings, one of the few men willing to publicly support women's right to vote. They faced criticism, of course, but it was different now. Grace had proven herself valuable to the community, and Vincent's reputation protected them both from the worst of the backlash. "Do you ever regret it?" Vincent asked one night when they were both exhausted from a long day. "Do you ever wish you had stayed in Boston, found some university that would let you teach?" Grace looked at him in genuine surprise. "Never, not once." "Vincent, in Boston I would have been a curiosity at best, tolerated but never truly accepted. Here, I am building something real. The library, the children, our family, all of it matters in a way that standing in front of a lecture hall never could have. Even with all the resistance you faced. All the shame they tried to make you feel. Especially because of that," Grace said firmly. "Every girl who comes into this library and sees that a woman can be educated and respected, every boy who learns that intelligence is attractive rather than threatening, they are proof that it was worth it. We are changing minds, Vincent. Slowly, one person at a time, but it is happening." Henry grew into a serious, thoughtful boy with a passion for science. He conducted experiments in the barn, much to Vincent's amusement, and peppered Grace with questions about everything from astronomy to zoology. Julia was more social, organizing the younger children in the library and showing early signs of being a natural teacher. Michael was still too young to show clear interests, but he had inherited his father's easy charm and his mother's stubborn streak in equal measure. Tom got married to a lovely woman named Sarah who taught at the school with him, and they had children of their own. The ranch prospered, with Vincent implementing new techniques he learned from agricultural journals Grace ordered for the library. They built the bigger house he had dreamed of, with a proper study for Grace and space for their growing family. On their 10th anniversary, the town held a celebration at the library, officially renaming it the Sawyer Community Library in honor of their contributions. Grace stood beside Vincent, watching the people who had once shamed her now applauding her work, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not vindication exactly, but something better. The knowledge that persistence and love had won out over fear and prejudice. "Smart women are the best kind of women to know," Vincent whispered in her ear, echoing the words that had started it all. "And cowboys who believe that are the best kind of men to love," Grace whispered back. The years passed in a blur of activity and joy. Grace continued expanding the library's programming, adding classes in mathematics and science, starting a lecture series that brought speakers from Sacramento and San Francisco. Vincent's ranch became known for producing some of the finest cattle in California, and he used his success to mentor younger ranchers, teaching them the same lessons about innovation and improvement he had learned from Grace. Henry left for university at 18, planning to study engineering. Julia followed 2 years later, determined to get her teaching certificate like her mother. Michael, at 15, was still deciding his path, but showed aptitude for business that suggested he might take over the ranch someday. Grace and Vincent found themselves alone in the big house more often, their children grown and building lives of their own. But they were not lonely. They had each other, the work they both loved, and the satisfaction of knowing they had made a difference. "Remember when I was just the educated woman they wanted to shame?" Grace said one evening. They were in their study, she reading Greek while Vincent worked on ranch accounts, a scene that had played out thousands of times over the years. "I remember thinking they were the biggest fools I had ever met," Vincent said, "missing out on knowing you just because you were smart." "You changed everything," Grace said, setting down her book. "That day you walked me to the boarding house and told me smart women were the best kind to know, you gave me hope. You made me believe I could have the life I wanted." "You would have found your way regardless," Vincent said. "You are too stubborn and too brilliant not to." "I just got lucky enough to be there when you did." "We both got lucky," Grace said, moving to sit beside him. Two people who refused to accept what the world told them they should be, finding each other against all odds. Vincent pulled her close, kissing her with the same passion he had shown on that first evening on the porch. "Best decision I ever made," he said, "telling you that smart women are the best kind. Though it probably would have been more accurate to say that you specifically are the best kind of woman. The only kind I could ever love." "Flatterer," Grace teased, but her eyes were bright with tears. Tom took over the school fully when the old headmaster retired, implementing reforms that made Stockton's education system one of the most progressive in the region. He credited Grace with inspiring him, and Vincent with showing him what true support looked like. Ellen's lending library had spawned 3 others in neighboring towns, creating a network of resources that benefited the whole county. Grace lived to see women get the right to vote, casting her ballot with fierce pride. She lived to see her children become parents themselves, to hold her grandchildren and watch them learn to read in the library she had built. She lived to see attitudes toward educated women shift, slowly but surely, until young girls in Stockton could dream of university without facing the shame she had endured. And through it all, through every triumph and challenge, every joy and sorrow, Vincent was there. Her partner, her champion, her love. The cowboy who had seen her worth when the world wanted to diminish her, who had loved her mind as fiercely as he loved her heart, who had built a life with her that honored both of them fully. On their 50th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Grace stood before the library they had created together and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Not just for the institution itself, though she was proud of it, but for everything it represented. Proof that love could overcome prejudice. Proof that education could transform communities. Proof that one person standing up and saying, "This is wrong," could change the world, especially when they found someone willing to stand with them. "Smart women are the best kind of women to know," Vincent said, his voice shakier with age but no less certain. "I said that 50 years ago, and I have spent every day since then being proved right. And cowboys who believe that are the best kind of men to love," Grace said, completing their ritual exchange. "I said that 50 years ago, and I have spent every day since then being proved right too." They kissed, to the applause and cheers of their family, and Grace thought about that girl with her Latin verbs and her broken schoolhouse window. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what was coming. The fear and struggle, yes, but also the love, the triumph, the life beyond anything she had imagined. She would tell her that the shame was temporary but the education was forever, that the man who would see her worth was on his way, that everything she was building toward was real and possible and worth every hard moment, but she could not go back, so instead she would go forward. There were still books to order for the library, still classes to teach, still grandchildren to read to. There was still a ranch to help run, still a community to serve, still a husband to love and be loved by. Grace Sullivan Sawyer had been shamed for being educated, but she had refused to let that shame define her. She had found a cowboy who believed smart women were the best kind to know, and together they had built something extraordinary. Not just a library or a ranch or a family, though those were all precious, but a legacy of belief in education, in equality, in the radical idea that intelligence was something to celebrate rather than fear. And that legacy would outlive them both, spreading through the children they had taught and raised and inspired, through the books they had shared and the minds they had opened, through the simple but revolutionary act of loving each other exactly as they were. An educated woman and a cowboy who saw her worth, changing their world one day at a time, one book at a time, one mind at a time. It was enough. It was everything. And as Grace stood there with Vincent's hand in hers, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, she knew she would not change a single moment of it. The shame had been real, but so was the love that conquered it. And in the end, love had won. Years later, long after both Grace and Vincent had passed, the Sawyer Community Library still stood as a testament to their vision. The building had been expanded several times, the collection grown exponentially, but the core mission remained the same. Education for everyone, regardless of gender or background or circumstance. Knowledge as a right, not a privilege, and on the wall in a place of honor hung a photograph of the founders. Grace stood tall and proud, her intelligence evident in her direct gaze and confident posture. Vincent stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his expression one of unmistakable love and respect. And beneath the photograph, a simple plaque with the words that had started it all. Smart women are the best kind of women to know. Vincent Sawyer, founder. It was a message that continued to inspire, generation after generation, reminding people that education was nothing to be ashamed of, and that true love meant celebrating each other's strengths. The shame Grace had faced was not forgotten, but neither did it define her story. Instead, it became context for the triumph, proof of how far they had come and how much further they could go. Grace and Vincent's love story became legend in Stockton, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. But the core truth remained constant. An educated woman had faced hostility and shame, and a cowboy had stood up for her, loved her, built a life with her. Together they had changed not just their own lives but their entire community, proving that intelligence and love were not opposites but complements, each making the other stronger. Their children carried on their work in different ways. Henry's engineering innovations improved infrastructure across California. Julia became a prominent educator and advocate for women's rights. Michael expanded the ranch while maintaining his parents' commitment to progressive practices and community service. Each of them raised their own children with the values Grace and Vincent had instilled, creating ripples that spread far beyond Stockton. The Wild West that Grace and Vincent had known slowly faded into history, replaced by a more settled, civilized California. But the lessons they had taught remained relevant. The importance of education, the value of intelligence, the power of standing up for what you believe in, the beauty of loving someone for exactly who they are, and somewhere, In the part of consciousness that transcends death, Grace and Vincent watched it all unfold with satisfaction. They had not set out to change the world, just to live their lives authentically and love each other fully. But in doing so, they had created something that lasted far beyond their years. A legacy of courage, conviction, and unconditional love that continued to inspire long after they were gone. That was the true happy ending, not just that they found love with each other, though that was precious and central to everything else, but that their love had created something bigger than themselves, something that improved the world and made it a little bit kinder, a little bit wiser, a little bit more open to the possibility that smart women were indeed the best kind of women to know, and that the men who recognized that truth were the best kind of men to love. In the end, Grace Sullivan and Vincent Sawyer proved that education and love were not threats but gifts, that shame could be overcome by conviction, and that two people standing together could move mountains. Their story was one of triumph over prejudice, of love conquering fear, of intelligence being celebrated rather than suppressed. And it all started with a broken schoolhouse window, a cowboy who saw worth where others saw threat, and the simple but radical statement that smart women are the best kind of women to know. From that beginning, everything else followed, a lifetime of love and learning and legacy that proved the truth of those words over and over again. Grace had been shamed for being educated, but she had not let that shame win. Vincent had said smart women were the best kind to know, and he had spent his life proving he meant it. Together they had built not just a marriage but a movement, not just a family but a future, not just a library but a living testament to the power of knowledge and love combined. That was their story, complete and whole and perfect in its own way. A Wild West love story that proved the frontier was not just about land and cattle and adventure, but about minds meeting, hearts joining, and two people deciding that together they could create something extraordinary. And they had, beyond anything they could have imagined on that dusty street in Stockton when a teacher with too much education met a cowboy with enough wisdom to see her worth. They had lived fully, loved completely, and left the world better than they found it. What more could anyone ask for? What more perfect ending could there be than a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy that would inspire for generations to come? Grace and Vincent had found their happily ever after, and in doing so, they had helped countless others find theirs too.